Hey Burwood Church, this week as we continue our series on the story of the Bible, we're going to be looking at the nation of Israel, and in particular, one of its greatest kings, King Solomon. But to start us off, I want to take our minds back to the story of Abraham that we looked at 2 weeks ago, and I want to review some of those far-reaching promises known as the covenant that God made with Abraham. And here they are. Number 1, God said, I will make you a great nation. Number 2, I will give you uncountable descendants. They will be like the sand on the seashore. Number 3, God said, I will give you land from the borders of Egypt all the way up to the river Euphrates. God said, I will give you this land as a home for your descendants. Number 4, God said, I will bless you and you will be a blessing and all peoples of the world will be blessed through you. Basically, God's vision was this, that this nation would be a shining light on the earth, and that through it, the love of God would be made known to the whole world. And as they lifted God up before the nations, people would be drawn to him. And as this happened, the borders of Israel would expand and expand and expand until eventually the whole world, all the peoples of the world would be united back together as the family of God. Incredible vision. But the question I have for us today is this: how close did Israel actually get to realizing this vision? Well, from the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus is a period of 2,000 years. And right in the middle of that, we find this character that we're looking at today, King Solomon. And if there was ever a time when God's covenant vision came tantalizingly close to being fulfilled, it was during the time of Solomon. And I want to show you this by looking at a few verses from 1 Kings chapter 4. This is what it says. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Now notice that language. It's directly from the covenant that God made with Abraham. That promise of descendants has happened. And it goes on to say they ate, they drank, and they were happy. You see, God is blessing them, and as he's blessing them, it's resulting in joy. And just that alone, I think, is a cool thing because it reminds us that God wants to bring joy into our life. And when God blesses us and we live in harmony with him, it results in happiness. Let's continue, verse 21. It says, and Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the borders of Egypt. Again, notice this language. Again, it's taken directly from God's covenant with Abraham. God promised that he would give them land from Egypt to the Euphrates. And in the time of Solomon, that actually happened. Verse 24. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, from Tifsah to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Peace, safety, happiness, abundance. What we're seeing here is the blessings of God being poured out upon his special nation. But remember, God promised Abraham, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so God's blessings were not just to be kept to themselves, they were to overflow to the nations around them. And was this happening as well? Well, in some ways, it was starting to happen. Verse 29 says this: God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. And some of you might remember that part of the story where Solomon asked God for wisdom, and God pours out his wisdom upon Solomon, and is described as he's known as the wisest man who ever lived. And it goes on to say, verse 34, from all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. What an incredible place of influence that the nation of Israel found themselves in. Like, kings are literally saying to their officials, go to Israel, go to King Solomon, and bring back some of that amazing wisdom that is over there, because we want to prosper like they do. I mean, has there ever been a greater platform to proclaim the goodness of God to the world as there was during the reign of Solomon? Like, people are literally traveling far and wide, kings and kingdoms are sending people to sit at the feet of Solomon and to learn from him. Now, one story that I think is really cool is the story of the Queen of Sheba. Now, we don't know who she really was or where she came from, but she must have been a person of great significance. And she hears from far away this fame of Solomon and of his wisdom and of this God that he serves called Yahweh. And she goes and makes a personal visit. And she arrives in Jerusalem and with her entourage with her, and there's camels laden with gifts for King Solomon, exotic spices, and 4 tons of gold. And she comes with one primary objective: to sit and listen to the wisdom of Solomon. It's just amazing. And at the end of her visit, this is what she says in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 6. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw them with my very own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." Isn't that cool? This foreign queen coming and seeing the blessing of God and learning of God's love and his goodness. God's great promises that he made to Abraham, that lofty vision for the world, is on this incredible trajectory towards being fully realized. However, that trajectory is short-lived, and things quickly take this downward dive. Idolatry, that thing that God had expressly warned them about and forbidden, soon floods the nation. And after King Solomon dies, the nation is divided into the northern tribes and the southern tribes, and years of civil war follow. And after just 200 years, the northern tribes are conquered by the mighty Assyrians, and they're taken off into exile. And then just over another 100 years later, the rest of the nation is conquered by now the Babylonians. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and the people of Israel are taken captive and they're exiled to this foreign land. And so we go from this lofty reign of Solomon to absolute national ruin in just 300 years. And it's a complete disaster. And the question that calls out to us from the story is why? Why have God's promises and God's vision seemingly fail? Now, there's probably a lot of different answers that could be given. But in your discussions in your groups, I want you to focus primarily on the story of Solomon. And there's a number of passages that you're going to look at, which will give little insights into those aspects of Solomon's life that maybe weren't quite in harmony with God as it might have seemed on the surface. The first passage you're going to look at is Deuteronomy Chapter 17, where you find this set of instructions that God gave specifically for the future kings of Israel. Think about that. When Solomon came to sit on the throne and to rule over Israel, there was a series of instructions that were specifically given by God to him to follow that would protect the safety and the prosperity of him and of the nation. But the problem is this: Solomon completely disregarded these instructions. And what you're going to do in your groups is compare the actions of Solomon and these instructions. And what you're going to see is that one by one, Solomon absolutely ignores them in extreme ways. Now, the second thing that you're going to look at is that part of the covenant that said, "I will bless you and you will be a blessing." So God, and we see in this story here, God is pouring out this abundant blessing upon Israel. And Solomon is at the head of that. And that blessing, God's purpose of that blessing is that it would transform the world. It wouldn't just bring joy to their lives, but to the lives of everyone around them. But did this actually happen? Did Solomon actually allow this to overflow to those around them, or did it really become all about Solomon? And then did he just find himself hoarding the blessings of God? That's what you're going to be discussing in your groups. Now, thirdly, in your groups, you're going to look at the Book of Ecclesiastes. And the Book of Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon. It's basically his life story written out. And what you're going to find in the passage that we look at is that at the height of Solomon's reign, he actually found himself having a full-blown existential crisis. And you're going to look at why did he experience this and what can we learn from it? Now, here's what I think might be happening at this point in Solomon's life, where he's saying these words, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. I think Solomon finds himself in this place of despair because he fails to realize that his story is a part of a much bigger story. That he was living out a crucial, important chapter of an eternal story, the story of God. And that this story was an eternal story that would never end, a story where perfection and harmony would be restored to all of God's creation and where God's family would live together in happiness one day and happiness and love for all the ceaseless ages of forever. But instead, Solomon falls into this trap of thinking that everything was about him. And he starts thinking about his life and how short it is and how one day all of these things, his story is going to come to an end. And he fails to realize that he's a part of that grand, big story that we've been learning about in this series. And the thing is, it's a trap that we can fall into as well. As we look at the world around us, it's very easy for us to become disillusioned and discouraged. But when we walk daily with Jesus, and when we see how our lives are a crucial part of God's eternal story, and when we see how our lives can contribute to that story, wow, then our lives become about something much greater. And that can make a huge difference in our lives. So there we go. Over to you. All the best in your groups as you discuss and you unpack this part of the story. Have a wonderful Sabbath. Have a great weekend. And remember, your story is not all that there is. You are part of something bigger, something of eternal significance. You are part of God's story. God bless and have a wonderful time discussing this, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other sometime soon.